It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is going to be a real treat, listeners.
It is, and Amazon is what we're going to be talking about for part of the show, for the first part of the show. And it's the largest corporation the world has ever known. It's valued at over $1 trillion. Amazon is hardly the first American corporation to expand, monopolize, and eat up everything in its path, but it may be the most diversified. Our first guest today is a journalist who, in the grand muckraking tradition of Upton Sinclair, is popping the bubble wrap that swaddles this mega corporation. His name is Alec MacGillis, and his book is called Fulfillment. In it, he explores what happens when Amazon moves into your neighborhood and when their definition of fulfillment becomes more important than the fulfillment of the communities where they set up shop. He profiles Americans whose lives have been upended by Amazon's monster expansion, and he'll be joining us to discuss the social, political, and environmental aspects that follow in this Godzilla's wake. Our second guest will be our friend Dr. Michael Carone from Public Citizens Health Research Group. We'll be asking him some of our burning questions about the newer COVID-19 variants and how the current crop of COVID vaccines stack up against them. Then we contacted Flyers Rights to answer a particular listener question about your options when trying to avoid flying in the 737 MAX. As always, we will check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, who will fill us in on the latest news on the corporate crime in the suites. But first, let's rake some muck. David?
Alec MacGillis covers politics and government for ProPublica, is the author of The Cynic, a 2014 biography of Senator Mitch McConnell, and his latest book is Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America, which you can buy at your local bookstore. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Alec MacGillis.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here.
Welcome, Alec. I met Alec when he was up in Connecticut as a young reporter with great promise. Grew up in Pittsfield, and later he wrote a very powerful article on the 737 MAX Boeing crash and the grieving but organized families for the New Yorker. Alec, I want to tell our listeners this is more than just a book on Amazon. It could have been titled A Book on Amazon's America. So you do focus on Amazon in some distinct detail, of course, but you also show the kind of America that Amazon fit into, exploited, and is significantly transforming, not only into wider inequities and displacement of Main Street USA, but also dividing geographical areas even further, where areas like Seattle, the San Francisco Bay Area, Boston, Austin, Texas, Washington, D.C., are booming, often at the expense of their extractive impact of smaller towns and cities. I want to start with Jeff Bezos himself. He's a fellow Princetonian. He majored in chemical engineering, went to work for Wall Street, started studying the emerging internet, and said, you know, someone's going to make a lot of money from this internet, and I want that someone to be me. So he gets into a car, and he drives all the way to Seattle and sets up shop selling books at a discount, figuring that that's the way he could edge into becoming a multi-vendor conglomerate. Now, tell us a little bit about Bezos. Warren Buffett called him the smartest businessman in America. It's quite an encomium coming from Mr. Buffett, who's achieved a number of breakthroughs himself. And there's no doubt that there's a genius behind this man, but there's also a childish aspect to him. And before I ask you to sort of give us a thumbnail profile, what motivates this man to never think that the word enough has any meaning? In your book, on page 315, you have this aspect of his personality. Quote, on the topic of energy consumption, Jeff Bezos was quite blasé. It was why we needed to go to the moon. Quote, we will run out of energy on Earth, end quote, he would say a few weeks later. Quote, this is just arithmetic. It's going to happen, period, end quote. Well, of course, he has extraterrestrial business along with Elon Musk, but it's totally childish to make a comment like that when certainly the sun is not going to leave the earth and wind is not going to leave the earth. Give us your appraisal of this man whom you couldn't interview for your book.
Yeah, I could not interview him, and I would have, of course, been glad to. But since the book itself was not really about Amazon per se, I was not too concerned about the inability to speak with him. But one thing I think is at his core is, and this may be true of some other of our titans, industrial titans, tech titans over the years, but I think it's especially strong with him, which is he has a real fear of stasis. He has a fear of slowing down and of allowing his company to settle into any kind of sort of steady state or sort of equilibrium. It's a little bit of the philosophy of the shark, that you've got to keep moving and moving fast and growing. And if you're not growing fast, that you're going to sort of wilt and atrophy and fall apart. That's where this constant will to get bigger, to dominate, to move into other industries, other sectors comes from. It was in his recent letter, his investor letter, there was one line that caught my eye. He said something like, we're getting a lot of flack these days on various fronts, but we're not going to allow ourselves to settle into the status quo equilibrium around us. And it was a very striking kind of phrase. It was, that we're going to keep striving, we're going to keep trying to dominate.
He has this other phrase too, day one.
Yes, it's always day one at Amazon, that this notion that every single day is you're a startup every single day. You're always growing, you're always launching. It's never just another day, it's always day one. That's one of the core notions there. And the moon, his obsession with space travel, which goes all the way back to his childhood, is also, it's an important facet of him, and it speaks to, in some sense, to a kind of that quote you read, about, well, of course we're going to have to go up there. Of course we're going to have to leave this earth behind. There's something a little bit, he's untethered from the mundanities that the rest of us, the sort of world the rest of us live in. He sees himself as separate from that. The other amazing quote, it's incredibly stunning quote in the book, it was when he was asked why he did not give more money, why he was so abstemious in his philanthropic giving. And just a couple of years ago, he said, well, I really don't see what difference I can make with my billions, other than trying to find us a new home up in space. And that's really the most I can do for humanity. It was such a striking and telling line that with all these vast needs all around us, the very kind of human basic needs, he couldn't really be troubled with them. The final thing I'll say in this regard is a remarkable answer I got from Nick Hanauer, who was one of the first investors in Amazon, became, very wealthy because of this. His early investment in Amazon helped bring Amazon to Seattle, his hometown, and he's now returned quite critical of the company. And when I asked him why Amazon wasn't considering putting its second headquarters in a part of the country that could really use it, in a city like St. Louis or Baltimore or Cleveland that could really use that kind of boost, and in one fell swoop, the company could just do a lot to sort of rebalance the landscape of opportunity and prosperity in the country. In fact, they ended up choosing not a single one of those sorts of cities, and even their top 20 finalists for that headquarters included no Detroit, no Cleveland, no St. Louis. And I asked Nick Hanauer, why is that? Why not even consider that those cities as options? And he laughed. He laughed at me. He laughed in my face. Essentially, he said, "You do not understand Jeff Bezos at all, do you? You have to realize this is a matter of thinking of this question that way is simply not how he does things. He's not thinking about what's best for the country, what's best for our society. That simply does not enter into the calculus at all for him. The question is all about what is best for the company and the company's future growth. That is it."
Would you characterize his trait as avaricious, that he's really counting billions? Indicate to our listeners how much he's made in this period of COVID-19 pandemic.
His fortune grew by about $60 billion in the past year. So basically from March, the start of the lockdowns last year to this past March, grew by just under $60 billion.
That's 60
billion.
Mm-hmm.
Just astonishing in a single year. And he, one hesitates to use some of our, kind of biblical phrases but one reader who wrote me responding very strongly to the book with the phrase that they used, they just kept talking about the quote extreme greed represented in the book and just how upsetting they found it, and that to them that was the main trait, the main kind of theme sort of documented throughout the book. One of the more upsetting moments of the book for me in reporting it was being at a huge banquet that was held for Bezos in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2018 as the company was deciding where to put the second headquarters. And he was hosted at this banquet. It was a meeting of the Economic Club of Washington, which is sort of a VIP power movers kind of gathering in DC. These dinners are led by David Rubenstein, who's the co-founder of the Carlyle private equity firm, huge, powerful private equity firm based in Washington that made its money initially off of the military industrial complex. And Rubenstein now is a big philanthropist himself, and he leads these talks with notable guests. And he was up there on stage with Bezos, with hundreds of people, in the audience, just all the VIPs, the editor of the Washington Post, which Bezos owns, and all sorts of muckety-mucks in DC, including many elected officials and federal officials. And they spent a good 5, 6, 7 minutes of the talk of up there on stage just joking about how wealthy they both were, and joking about the fact that Bezos had just surpassed, I guess it was Bill Gates, to become the richest man in the world. And how did he like being the richest man in the world compared to the second richest man in the world, and yada, yada, yada. And it was all being played for great laughs. And it was quite a moment of our new Gilded Age to watch that.
I thought that was one of the most telling parts of your book. Listeners should know that Alec is reporting on things he witnessed directly. He went all over. This is not a book, full of citations of reports on Amazon or court decisions on Amazon. But you went into a level of detail that astounded me, and I want to ask you this. I've never quite seen anything like this. You're talking about a fellow named Keith Taylor, and among his other interests, he wanted to create a physical memorial for the Bethlehem Steel Sparrows Point complex in Baltimore. This is in the heyday of steelworkers. They were unionized. They had relatively high wages, benefits, pensions, job security, and they were manufacturing something real, steel. So he's going around collecting artifacts from various dumpsters. And on page 311, you say, he put on some gloves and clambered into the dumpster, from which he began heaving the trash into a second dumpster that was serendipitously only 10 feet away. Out it went, big coils of plastic drainage tubing, a DirecTV dish, Fireball bottles, Hennessy bottles, an oil can, a hard hat. By day's end, he's reached the lower strata that he was after. There were a few thousand of the bricks, more than enough for his project, end quote. How did you get that detail?
I got that detail because I was in the dumpster with him. It was one of those moments where you think, how did this happen? How in the world did I end up on a freezing cold day standing inside a large dumpster for hours on this peninsula outside Baltimore? I had reached out to, I knew I was going to be doing a big chapter on the sort of the spiritual heart of the book, really, is that chapter on the transformation of what was the largest steel mill in the world in the late 1950s with 30,000 employees, huge company town directly adjacent to the mill. And that has all been completely wiped off the face of this peninsula, the Sparrows Point Peninsula outside Baltimore, and has now been replaced by a logistics business park with a whole bunch of warehouses, including now 2 Amazon warehouses. And I was doing all sorts of research on Sparrows Point, spent a lot of time at the library, going to old news clippings, read all these books, and I happened across this fellow, Keith Taylor, who used to work at the mill and had now founded something called the Sparrows Point Historical Society, which is basically a one-man effort to reclaim and save some of the heritage of this extraordinary steel mill that had been such a core part of the identity of Baltimore and of the lives of so many workers. And I reached out to him, and he said, "Oh, it just so happens I'm going to be there today looking for some bricks, and they were bricks from the demolished headquarters building of the steel mill. That was the building from the 30s or 40s that had been the administrative headquarters, and it had been demolished along with everything else. And he knew that there were bricks in this dumpster. Unfortunately, regular trash had been put on top of the bricks. So we spent hours in the freezing cold. It was December of 2018, going through the dumpster and just trying to get down to those bricks.
Well, that certainly is your modus of operandi. You want to see it, feel it, challenge it, observe it, analyze it, and that's what makes this book so readable, listeners. Before we get into the real nitty-gritty of Amazon power over workers, over consumers, our listeners are waiting for that. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions. How did Amazon react to your book, just quickly?
It was radio silence for the first month, and then finally there was a letter from Jay Carney, who's their head PR guy, government relations guy, who of course used to be, your listeners will recognize his name from the Obama White House. He was Obama's spokesman, press secretary for a while. Before that worked for Biden in the White House, and actually before that was a journalist. And he's now Amazon's chief poobah. And he sent a letter to the New York Times Book Review, Sunday Book Review, attacking a favorable review that the book had gotten, and by association attacking the book.
Well, one thing you were very fair to Amazon, because you often gave their response to the criticism by people who you interviewed or you observed, especially, for example, the congressional hearing in the House. I didn't see much about the board of directors. I checked the board of directors. There are about 10, including the notorious Jamie Gorelick, the heavyweight lobbyist that got huge money from a very brief stint with Fannie Mae. And my best guess is that Bezos has made them each at least worth $30 million just from stock options, each one.
Wow.
So they're a pretty passive board, obviously. They're not going to give them much trouble. And for a company whose stock valuation is almost $2 trillion now, there isn't a very sizable and representative board. So he has complete control. He has about 11% of the stock, which is only half of the percent that Zuckerberg has of Facebook, but he's much richer than Zuckerberg. And the other thing I didn't see much of was you're interviewing truck drivers. We were talking with Alec MacGillis, the author of the book Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America, which has gotten rave reviews, and he's gotten a lot of interviews in the last few weeks since the book came out. And on the cover of the book is this flat plane with a 4-lane highway and one of the 18-wheeler trucks, presumably an Amazon truck. Is there a reason other than time that you didn't focus on either one of those?
So as for the board of directors, I really made a decision, at the outset that this book was not going to be, really about Amazon itself. And there have been some good books written on the company, including Brad Stone's Everything Store. Brad's actually coming out with another kind of updated book on the company in just in a month or so. The whole book really for me started as a book not about Amazon at all, but about regional disparities in America. And that's what I set out to write about. And then I secondarily came to Amazon as a good frame through which to tell the story of those disparities. So I mentioned Jamie Gorelick in the chapter about Amazon's takeover of Washington, D.C., because she's sort of a key figure in that context. But as far as trying to get to the board of directors or trying to get to various executives, it was not a priority to me in my reporting. As far as the truck drivers go, I do have a fairly key truck driver figure in my chapter on sort of rural decline and rural isolation, the chapter that's based in Southeast Ohio, where I met a man who used to work at the local boot making factory. And then when he lost his job at the local boot making factory, when it shut down, he ended up becoming a truck driver in the Columbus area, commuting an hour each way to be a truck driver in Columbus and making deliveries. He often made deliveries of goods to the Amazon warehouses, basically essentially goods coming from manufacturers or coming from wholesalers to the Amazon warehouses, where they would then be packed and go out with delivery guys. I did not end up featuring any Amazon, any of the Amazon's own delivery drivers, who of course usually don't work for the company. They're contractors technically, although they wear the Amazon garb and drive Amazon trucks. I did not, feature one of them, partly because of the extraordinary pressure that Amazon puts on its current employees not to speak to the press. You have to sign a non-disclosure agreement when you go to work at Amazon, which is something I found when I myself applied for a job there. And then also the fact that I was careful I didn't want the book to be a matter of just finding X person and Y person just to sort of fit a schematic kind of structure. I wanted there to be some serendipity. And so, in a way, I started my reporting in certain places that I was most interested in, and then decided to focus on certain people as I came across them in those places. But I didn't go out in a way to say, okay, I've got to find a this type and a that type and a that type.
Okay, fair enough. I spotted Amazon rising a long time ago, and I was really amazed at how many signals Amazon gave to its competitors and opponents that were ignored. For example, it was quite clear what Amazon's strategy was going to be right off in the mid 1990s. And the elbow room they got was they avoided paying sales tax on books. And that could be 6, 7, 8%. You cover that in your book. So I called the National Federation of Independent Business, supposed to represent small business. And they were either clueless or in the pockets of the Chamber of Commerce that never goes after any business. And they weren't alert to how small bookstores and other stores selling books were being severely disadvantaged by a 7 to 8% privilege that Amazon was acquiring for itself. The same with bookstores. Bookstores started shrugging off. Even the big bookstores started shrugging off Amazon as a threat. They didn't heed the growing signs. Citizen groups ignored Amazon's rise, even as stores started getting pinched and getting closed on Main Street. It's really quite extraordinary. Congress, of course, was very late to the game, and they had trouble even educating themselves about the kind of questions to ask Amazon reps at congressional hearings. I'm laying this predicate for the following question. It's quite clear, and you're not really didactic and moralistic. That's why the book is so readable, Alec. But how would you imagine an America without Amazon? What if you were empowered by the federal and state governments to sort of reorder the place of something like Amazon? What would you do to diminish Amazon's baleful influence on America, on workers, on consumer complicity with various maneuvers, which we're going to talk about in a minute?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think you would end up considering some of the tougher antitrust approaches that are now being very belatedly being considered in Washington. And I do think that there's some real prospect of action on that front. There are signs that the Biden administration is going to be taking this more seriously than the very lax Obama regime did, and that we really are about to have a big debate on this score, not unlike what happened almost exactly 100 years ago with an earlier generation of monopolies. You know, I talked a lot about this with Amazon itself, with their press people over many months, where their basic line to me was, look, we know none of this is ideal. We know that the warehouse work is pretty grueling. We know that these are not the greatest jobs and all that. We know that our dominance is somewhat unseemly, but if it weren't us, it would be someone else. That's their basic line. It's a fairly sort of dispiriting kind of, as PR lines go, it's fairly bleak. It's essentially, you know, there are these bigger things that have happened in the economy, globalization, technology, e-commerce, all that, and there's always going to be some giant filling that.
And you know, there's a grain of truth in that, and that is if you take the antitrust proposals by people like the new Federal Trade Commissioner, Lena Khan, you mentioned in your book, it's basically focusing on the platform, the unfair competition. When they put businesses on the platform, they get data that they use against the businesses. They compete with the same products directly with their cloistered consumer constituency. And, you know, in other words, look, if it isn't Amazon, it's 5 Amazons broken up. I mean, what difference does it make in terms of the kind of qualitative devastation that you outline in your book? And that's why I would like you in the future, Alec, if you could, to imagine a different future, not just of a changed or diminished Amazon, but of a changed way of production, marketing, transporting, and controlling the consumer constituency. that is so incarcerated now in a credit card economy that they've even lost control over their own money and can be penalized at will. So let's get to some really nitty-gritty questions. Do you buy from Amazon?
Very, very seldom. I do not have a Prime account, and I buy from them only if there's some obscure used book I can't find elsewhere.
That's a good response from my point of view. And you point out that Amazon Prime is now part of the life of maybe 100 million people in this country. This is unprecedented market penetration. Once you buy into Amazon Prime, you stop looking at alternatives to Amazon products because the advantages are so great. They lock you in.
Right.
And some of my best friends, to use a cliche, have been trapped by Amazon Prime, and they don't even look elsewhere. I want to read a short letter by my nephew who has developed a way to look elsewhere. He wrote a letter to the New York Times recently in response to New York Times columnist Farhad Manjou's column, which was titled, "Who Can Help Amazon's Workers? It's Shoppers," end quote. And Farhad didn't have very many specifics on how consumers can discipline Amazon, other than complaining to the government, etc. So Tarek decided to share his own experience. And here's his short letter. Quote, "I make no effort to boycott Amazon. I've just opened my eyes to the many occasions when the company has wasted my time, an unpardonable sin in my book. Repeatedly, Amazon has let me down the garden path to a dead end or lousy purchase. Cheap prices left me too lazy to return faulty, poorly described, or substandard merchandise, yet it adds up to considerable waste. So, I've moved most of my business to other vendors," which raises the point that Manjou missed. Mom and pop plus software will beat Amazon. Once buying data are known, its warehouses won't be able to compete with last-mile distributed products. But absent restraint, the company will choke this kind of innovation. A few years ago, faced with Amazon's requirement that I add more items to some pen refills in order to trigger shipping, I walked to my local stationery store and bought them. What would once have been utterly mundane is still a pleasant memory, end quote. What's your reaction to that as an approach to avoid Amazon?
Oh, absolutely. I do believe that we all have agency in this regard. Yes, there are these larger forces acting on us. Yes, there's all sorts of, technological forces driving our lives, but we do still have agency. We absolutely can at least moderate this extraordinary reliance on a single company. I mean, what happened this past year was just astonishing, the degree of alacrity with which we even further embraced the company and the kind of one-click life with for many of us, if there had been at some point some compunction about going full Amazon, that was out the window now because we felt like we had the kind of permission and approval and even encouragement of the public health authorities to kind of take that approach. It wasn't just that you could order Amazon without guilt. You could actually now do it with some feeling of virtue. And as we now move out of this terrible year, I think it's very important that we sort of re-engage with the physical world around us, with our local economies. One of the strongest voices against Amazon has been Stacy Mitchell. I'm sure you know, with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which has been for years now sort of fighting on behalf of locally rooted economies, small-scale economies. And she's such a strong voice of advocacy against the sort of one-click life. I'll say that there is now one of the few hopeful signs, emerging of late has been the prospect of a real competitive threat to Amazon in the form of this company, Shopify, and not to, careful about being some kind of corporate booster here because they're a big company in their own right. But it's been very interesting to watch what's been happening where this company based in Canada is now essentially just what you mentioned, what Tarek mentioned, offering small businesses, merchants, the technological means to set up their own e-commerce sites, make them very smooth running and seamless without them having to sell through Amazon. I mean, Amazon's big big, huge moneymaker these last few years has been getting all sorts of third-party sellers, as they call them, to sell on the site. More than half the goods on the site now are from these third-party merchants who feel like they have no choice but to sell on Amazon because that's where all of us go to buy everything. And they end up paying these enormous fees and commissions to sell on the site. And it's enormously lucrative for Amazon. So if there's now a realistic, smooth-running option for companies to simply sell on their own, that could make a difference. But
well, the important point you made is that maybe not using this phrase, but when consumers say, hey, look, it's a good deal, Amazon, they're reliable, they're efficient, I buy standard products, I don't often have to return them. They're not considering other costs that are imposed on them, because by Amazon concentrating commerce in fewer and fewer regions of the country, sucking the economic life out of Main Street USA, what's the consequence for those consumers in those small communities? Well, there's less property tax being paid because these stores are boarded up and these companies are going out of business,
right,
which means there's less money for the schools, which means either schools suffer or the property tax has to go up on those very Amazon consumers. The second thing is a lot of Amazon consumers are becoming Amazon workers. We know how union busting they are. We know how they treat their warehouse workers, and you give very, very good examples of that in your book. I mean, the bathroom breaks and the kind of constant hectoring, the constant surveillance of every move of these workers, the turnover. Amazon says, well, we now pay them $15 an hour. Well, that was a late entry into a PR move. And of course, there are a lot of workers, you point out, don't get $15 an hour because they're gig type workers. And then, of course, there's the loss of the union fight in Bessemer, Alabama, which doesn't augur well for other union efforts around the country. Now, these would be called by economists external diseconomies of the private corporation known as Amazon. So what are your observations on this massive consumer complicity here? I know people who will order a hammer from Amazon, which means it's got to be coming from a warehouse, put in a truck or put in a postal truck and sent to the person who orders it. And 6 blocks away, there's a local hardware store just barely hanging on, who knows all the different homes and families and what their hardware needs are, and sells that same hammer. Give us a scenario of the consumer complicity here.
The consumer is absolutely complicit, and I try hard in the book to not be too explicit or scolding about this, but in a sense, the entire book is really an appeal to the consumer to show them all those externalities, to show them all the costs that lie behind their one-click seeming convenience. Tim Wu has been so eloquent on this score of the quote convenience of the Amazon purchase. He's a very sharp sort of legal mind on antitrust who's now actually in the Biden White House, which is a promising sign. And he wrote an op-ed a couple years ago called "The Tyranny of Convenience" in the Times, where he just pointed out this shouldn't be hard for people to grasp, but I think it often is, that we think about the choice of the Amazon purchase being more convenient than say having to go 10 blocks or a few miles to that hardware store to get the hammer there. What that overlooks, of course, is the fact that when that hardware store goes out of business because we've stopped patronizing them, then a few years from now, the choice will be between getting the hammer on Amazon or going to a hardware store 20 miles away or 10 miles away. So it will then be even more, quote, convenient to buy on Amazon because all the other options fall away and wither away. And that is really what we're now facing. And so I really do see the book as directed at that consumer. And let's be clear here, it's directed especially at the consumer in blue cities and towns who Amazon is universal, but its strongest demographic for a while now has been among middle and upper middle class, highly educated blue residents, and that demographic has become even stronger for them this past year because it was that demographic that went even more extremely into the kind of hunkered down one-click daily existence.
And that small hardware store owner pays property tax to the local schools, I might add. Now, in your book, you have a premonition of something rising, and you give a startling fact, and that is, although Amazon is hiring a lot of workers, of course, these are workers who have lost their jobs often from businesses who were displaced by Amazon. It's not like they're adding a million net workers. They're now the second biggest employer after Walmart. We're now seeing people feel sorry for Walmart. I mean, can you imagine? Walmart is now one of the major online competitors to Amazon. But you say that they already have 200,000 robots. It won't be long, right, Alec, when they'll have more robots than workers. The number of workers will diminish in warehouses and elsewhere. And they'll be trying to get the FAA to authorize delivering their products by drones to neighborhoods. I mean, is there any doubt about that being part of Amazon's business model?
Oh no, there's no doubt at all. It's all just a technical question at this point. It's interesting when you get into the warehouse work. The big remaining hurdle before they can get rid of a lot of the humans that are still working there is the technical challenge of teaching robots how to grab things. It's hard to teach robots how to grab things of different sizes and shapes, and that's the one thing that they still kind of need the humans for in the warehouses. So what's happened, it's astonishing what's happened in the warehouses in recent years, where the work has gotten much more automated. They have these incredible robots that zoom around with big tall stacks of shelves on them, kind of towers of shelves, and they zoom around and they somehow manage not to crash into each other, and then they bring the stack of shelves to a human picker who's standing there and just taking stuff out of the drawers as we, the consumer, orders it. And that picker used to be roaming the aisles and the corridors looking for items that were just stacked in permanent shelving, but now you have the robots that zoom around and bring the stuff to the picker. And in a way, the picker's work has gotten even more robotic itself. They're really just there, standing in place, taking stuff out of the drawers, and essentially reduced to this one task of grabbing. They will be replaced by a robot once they figure out how to teach the robot to grab.
Well, I noticed at the beginning of your book, you quote from Rudolf Wurlitzer's work, Nog, N-O-G. Here's the quote. I remain near the entrance, handling goods as they are shoved in, listening and nodding. I have been slowly dissolving into this cavity, end quote. We've been talking with Alec MacGillis, the author of Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One Click America. I think this has got to be a candidate for the Nonfiction National Book Award or Pulitzer Prize, listeners. You'll see when you get the book, when you contribute it to your local library, which is under severe budget strain all over the country, and when you talk it up among your thousands of book clubs, which, if you have a bylaw preventing nonfiction books from being discussed because they are argumentative and controversial, and you go for fiction instead, this is stranger than fiction. I always look at the way an expose book or an analytically revelatory book, in your case, ends. And you end in the following way. It's quite memorable. Page 337. Quote, a man was standing outside the hiring office run by Integrity, the human resources contractor, waiting for his Lyft ride home after coming to file a job application. He was 33 years old, and he was applying for the first regular job of his life. He had spent most of his adulthood making a good livelihood from selling heroin and fentanyl near Lexington Market on the west side of Baltimore's downtown. But that had gotten harder during the pandemic. With stores closed, his usual customers couldn't steal things to sell to support their habit. Quote, you can't steal. You can't do nothing, end quote, he said. Quote, it's definitely tough out here. Ain't no money out here, end quote. So here he was accepting the path that everyone, it seemed, was now taking. Quote, my other homeboy was talking about driving for Amazon. Everyone trying to come to Amazon, end quote. He wasn't sure how he was going to get by on warehouse wages, but he didn't really have a choice. Quote, it's definitely tough out here. It definitely ain't the same, end quote, he said. Quote, I got to change up how I'm doing everything, end quote. End of book. Your comment.
I was just amazed when I encountered that man. It was one of my last bits of reporting, going to the warehouse last spring, late spring, and I could not believe that this gentleman I started talking to is a fairly major opioid dealer in Baltimore, and I really felt almost like I'd stepped into season 6 of The Wire, where the drug dealers have to go to Amazon to get a job, because that's now the world. It's that the company's now so dominant, so ubiquitous, that even the hardened drug dealer ends up working there.
And what kind of feeling, Alec, did you think you left your many thousands of readers when they ended the book that way?
I hope that last line would actually would resonate with readers in a personal way. That we got to change up how we're doing everything, because otherwise, it's going to get even more dystopian.
Well, it was a memorable end, all right, and it made me think that maybe Amazon's ready to have a movie like Chinatown made in Hollywood on it. Our time is up, unfortunately. We've been talking with Alec MacGillis, the author of Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One Click America, published by Farrar Straus. Thank you very much. We look forward to all the awards this book is going to get before you come out with your next book and your next book. Thank you for your great work for our country's right to know. Alec MacGillis.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks to all of you.
We've been speaking with Alec MacGillis. We will link to Fulfillment at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we return, we're going to welcome back Dr. Michael Carome from Public Citizen, who's going to give us the latest on the COVID-19 variants and a new drug for Alzheimer's. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 7, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Think of corporate crime and think men getting into trouble. Women, not so much. And that's not because women are more ethical. It's because women haven't broken through to the top corporate ranks. Give women equal opportunity, and they will be equal to men in buckling to the corporate pressures to cut corners, get it done, and get in trouble. Mary Dodge is at the University of Colorado, Denver. She studies women in white-collar and corporate crime from all angles. Women are going to have to concede the point that there are very few women involved in instigating corporate crime, Dodge told Corporate Crime Reporter in an interview last week. My argument is that women have not had the opportunity to engage in corporate crime. If women were given the opportunity, perhaps we would see more corporate crime engaged by women. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. If you're a regular listener to this show, you may remember that we were talking about the possibility of a global pandemic 4 years ago. So on medical issues, we knew who to turn to stay ahead of the curve. David?
Dr. Michael Carome is an expert on issues of drug and medical device safety, FDA oversight, and healthcare policy. He is the director of Public Citizen's Health Research Group. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Michael Carome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michael. You know, the main concern now of people in this country, other than the vaccination of more and more people, are the variants, and the media is full of variants. They're coming from India, from Brazil, from South Africa, from Great Britain. And so far, the best medical advice out of people like Dr. Fauci is that the existing emergency-approved vaccines still can embrace them and keep you from going to a hospital or coming down with a serious case of COVID-19. But on the horizon, there's fear that some of these new variants may actually override the vaccine. What's the latest that you can tell us?
Sure. So these variants that we're talking about are mutated forms of the original virus that originated in China. And like all viruses, the COVID virus over time mutates as it proliferates from person to person and within a person. And there are actually already dozens of variants have been identified to date, and that's not unexpected. And fortunately, the variants that are currently spreading across the United States, it appears that the vaccines that are authorized protect people from these variants. You know, one in particular that's very common in the United States is from the United Kingdom. That variant actually is in the most recent data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is causing more than 50% of new infections in the US. But fortunately, the available vaccines are protective against that variant. The concern is, though, what's going to happen in the future? Because The virus is just on fire in other parts of the world, particularly the news out of India is distressing with hundreds of thousands, if, and probably they're close to 1 million cases a day, that so many cases are being missed. With that much proliferation of the virus going on, the opportunity for new mutations to develop is just very, very high. And the concern is that in the future, we are going to see a variant from this massive proliferation of the virus in other parts of the world that is resistant to the protection that we get from the currently available vaccines. And what that might mean is that we could have new outbreaks of infection in this country that are resistant to the vaccine, and we'll have to develop modified vaccines. And people who are currently protected would need probably booster shots that have been modified to protect against these new variants, should they develop. And so we'll have to sort of go back, start all over in terms of vaccinating our population in the US and anywhere else in the world where the vaccinations are being made available.
Michael, all these variants so far that I mentioned in these various countries don't seem to be that worrisome to infectious disease specialists here yet in terms of their being to override the vaccinations. Are you mostly referring to some new ones not yet detected that may come up in the coming months?
Yes. So since the original outbreak of the coronavirus, there have been dozens of variants identified to date, and many of those are circulating in the United States. And so far, the authorized vaccines that are available appear to offer significant protection against the common variants that are in this country. One in particular from the United Kingdom is actually causing about 55% of the infections, of the new infections in the US. And fortunately, the vaccines that we have are protective against that variant. The real concern is that as the vaccine proliferates and spreads in other parts of the world, and what's going on in India, for example, is just tragic, with hundreds of thousands of people getting sick where people are not vaccinated, that increases the likelihood that we're going to have additional mutations that lead to new variants that may escape the protection offered by the currently available vaccines. So that's the real danger, that until we suppress and control the pandemic around the world, we in this country and other countries where the vaccine is being used remain at risk for future variants that could reignite the panic here and lead to the need for changing our vaccines and beginning the whole vaccination process over for our population.
Well, the reach out from the U.S. is a no-brainer, it seems. Otherwise, we're going to get a boomerang and it'll be more devastating. Public Citizens estimated that for $35 billion, everybody in the world could be vaccinated. $35 billion is 1/5 of the fortune of Jeff Bezos. So the other thing is the patents that these drug companies have got on some aspects of all these vaccines, even though many of them were funded in terms of research and development by the taxpayers through the National Institutes of Health, they can be overridden too under the World Health Organization treaty and even under federal law. Could you tell our listeners, how do we sweep aside those two barriers? Otherwise, we're just inviting deadlier and deadlier extensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. The amount of money, $25, $30 billion, which is what we believe the U.S. should make available to make vaccines for the entire world, is a drop in the bucket. We are faced with an international public health catastrophe that is getting worse by the day. And what we need is to not have the monopolies of the vaccine makers stand in the way of the ability of countries to manufacture vaccine for their populations. And so we believe that through the World Health Organization, the monopolistic practices and patents need to be removed. The technology needs to be shared with countries so that they can ramp up production of these vaccines so that we can basically protect the entire world population. Otherwise, this pandemic will go on forever and it will indeed boomerang back to the US.
So the corporate capitalist system can't even allow a government like ours to confront omnicide. I mean, this is really getting serious, listeners. And again, let your members of Congress know how relatively easy it is to both overcome the patent monopoly obstacle and with other wealthy countries, ante up $35 billion for rapid in-site manufacturing in those third world countries, the necessary vaccines. We're out of time. Thank you, as always, Dr. Michael Carome, Director of the Health Research Group of Public Citizen. Michael, give our listeners the direct website and how they can learn about all the best pills, worst pills database you have.
Sure. Our main website is www.citizen.org, and our website for Worst Pills is worstpills.org.
Thank you very much, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Carome. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to do a little segue here to a listener question that we received a couple of weeks ago from a listener, Mark Erickson, who said, I have told my friends and family to avoid flights that use the MAX series planes. After I told my parents this, they took it seriously and became active in being sure to book flights that used non-MAX planes. Recently, they were able to arrange for another flight using a different aircraft when they learned that their original one was a MAX, but they were charged higher fees, not for the change, but because the other flight was just more at the time of the booking. Is there any way around this? Should my parents or anyone else in this situation simply ask for their original rate, which was lower? So we contacted Kendall from Flyers Rights, and she gave us the following response. David?
4 U.S. airlines currently operate the MAX: American, United, Southwest, and Alaska. Even if a passenger avoids the 737 MAX at the booking stage, airlines can change the type of plane at any time. 1. Alaska does not have a 737 MAX policy. Their website is silent on the flight change issue. But a spokesperson told Business Insider that they will work with passengers who are, quote unquote, uncomfortable with the MAX. 2. Southwest, likewise, does not have a guarantee. If you ask, they will try to put you on a new flight within 3 days of the original flight with no change fees or fare differentials. This policy ends on June 1st. 3. American and United guarantee to put you on the next available non-MAX flight with no change fees or fare differentials. United's policy is set to expire at the end of April for basic economy and the end of May for everyone else. Without these MAX policies, some passengers can still change their flights without change fees under the airline's COVID-era change fee waivers. However, passengers are on the hook for fare differentials. If a passenger is changing their flight, especially late in the game because of the MAX, their new flight will likely be more expensive. The passenger will have to pay extra in fare, even if they are not paying a change fee. While Southwest has not had change fees for a while, the general change fee waiver policies for American, United, and Alaska do not extend to basic economy saver tickets, the least expensive class of tickets on these airlines. The American and United 737 MAX guarantees are the friendliest while they last, as passengers, including basic economy, will not have to pay change fees or fare differentials, provided that the next available flight is suitable for them.
You know, the phrase while they last, it all comes down to how much heat we airline passengers put on the airlines. And so here's what I suggest. You have a minute to spare, call up your airline and give them a piece of your mind about the need to ground those planes until they're fixed in ways experts have pointed out again and again to the FAA, and to make it as easy as possible, if they're up in the air, for you to switch without you being charged reservation change fees. That's one. The second is, if you are flying, make a big deal. When you say, I want to fly to Albuquerque from Boston, you don't have a 737 MAX flying that, do you? And feed back to them that way. And then the third, if you ever are at the airport and they've switched planes on you and they haven't notified you, you should treat it like denied boarding. When you have a confirmed seat on an airplane and they overbook it, they've got to give you denied boarding compensation. So you have to fight back. Now, if you want to get up in the internet on your displeasure of the 737 MAX, our buttons, Axe the MAX, designed by Mr. Fish of Philadelphia, beautifully designed to convey the danger of the plane, are available. You can get them from going to go to nader.org, and you'll see how you can get 10 of them in one package. And look at the leverage. You put them on your lapel, and your friends and relatives, you take a picture, you put it up on the web, and thousands or tens of thousands of people will get the message. So use your leverage. Otherwise, you'll find more and more of these Maxes being bought by the airlines, and more of your choices being limited until on various routes you may have no choice. They're going to all be 737 Maxes. The families of the victims of the Indonesian Ethiopian crashes are still pressuring the FAA to get rid of the 4 top officials and have the Biden administration put a new team at the head. So they're fighting for you, and they've got good support in Congress. And to keep update, go to flyersright.org, FLYERS rights.org.
So thank you for that question, Mark and Kendall, for your answer from Flyers Rights. I want to thank our guests again, Alec MacGillis and Dr. Michael Carome. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has provided 2 separate form letters to send to your representatives demanding they take action on corporate crime and taxing the rich. 2 separate things. Just click on the clearly marked boxes in the right-hand corner of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour landing page, and it's all laid out there for you to fill in and personalize any way you want. Go to ralphnaderradiohour.com. Take action.
To support Whirlwind Wheelchair, visit whirlwindwheelchair.org. They do great work showing people in the United States and around the world how to build sturdy, economical wheelchairs from local materials. whirlwindwheelchair.org.
And for an independent news source that believes people are more important than corporations, go to populist.com to read or subscribe to the Progressive Populist.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we'll welcome author Pete Davis, whose book, Dedicated, explores how our restless modern society can get us stuck in infinite browsing mode. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And for your airline questions, go to flyersrights.org. They're there for you.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we continue our conversation with Alec MacGillis about Amazon.
Steve, David?
Yeah, Alec, I wanted to ask you a question. It's related to something Ralph touched on earlier, and it's just a hypothetical. If you were Jeff Bezos, doing sort of an undercover boss thing, and assuming, you had bringing your own conscience, not his, and you saw the company from the perspective from which you saw it, what would you do?
To try to improve it in some way?
Yeah, or just what would the effect? Yeah, what would a good guy do?
Oh, what would a good guy do?
Quit.
If you had talked to Jeff Bezos, you were Jiminy Cricket, his Jiminy Cricket. What would you be calling him?
Boy, there's so many things that could to lay off, just to dial back the whole tax credit game, that whole racket, which was what they call their quote economic development department, to dial back the insistence on secrecy and to become a little more transparent about things. One of the most depressing moments for me was the hiring when I went to apply for the job at the warehouse in Baltimore, and just to see just how profoundly demoralizing and depressing the sort of entry point is for workers into Amazon, where it kind of felt like going to the DMV, except even worse somehow. Just this kind of, it's such a profoundly dispiriting entry that one makes into the company, where it's just made very clear to workers that they're here only because they have no other choice, and essentially the company's going to take whoever they can get, whatever warm body they can take. It was anyone who can pass the drug test. So anything they could do to even just to make that process, that entry point, less depressing and more humane. But my goodness, there's so many other things I could mention.
That's for another program, right, Steve? And you've touched on an important issue. The latest data shows that Amazon is one of 50 companies that pays virtually no federal income tax in recent years. Virtually no federal income. That's the way they've gamed it around the world, with all the techniques that corporate law firms that don't get enough condemnation and their accountants have developed for them. So there's no end to the strategy of Jeff Bezos and Amazon to escape any kind of societal responsibility. David?
Small-time entrepreneurs tend to identify with Jeff Bezos, and they go partner up. They're encouraged to partner up with Amazon, self-publishing. Amazon will publish a book for you. They'll distribute your product. How does that usually turn out for the crypto Bezoses of the world when they partner up with Amazon?
What they often eventually find is that the Amazon's cut just gets bigger and bigger, and that's what's happened for a lot of these third-party sellers who initially thought this was a good deal for them because they get to, quote, sell to the whole world on the website. But then they find that in order to be competitive on the website, they have to spend more and more on advertising, on promotion. They end up what they thought was going to be a 15% cut ends up being closer to 30%. And then they're also just having all sorts of troubles with counterfeits on the site, with just other competitors on the site kind of playing games against them to try to knock them off, and real troubles in communicating with people at the company to try to deal with problems that come up. So there's just a litany of complaints that these third-party sellers who initially thought of themselves as partners end up having with selling there.
David, they come in and sign a contract saying 15% has to go to Amazon, and then Amazon unilaterally says it's going to, a year later say, it's going to go to 30%. Take it or leave it. So you got a new kind of peonage to these small business people or entrepreneurs that you have described.
Is it true that they sell somebody's widget, and then if they discover that that widget is selling a lot, then Amazon manufactures the widget? They almost use the third-party sellers as for a test market to figure out what to manufacture themselves. And is that legal?
They don't make anything. Amazon makes nothing. But your point is well taken. Describe in your book how they handled the diaper manufacturer.
Oh, this is absolutely how things work. The diaper manufacturer is a slightly separate issue. That was another form of sort of rapacious behavior where they just severely underpriced diapers on the site to basically force diapers.com, which was a rival e-commerce diaper seller, to not to go out of business, but to sell out to Amazon. So they absorbed the rival and then started raising the prices on the diapers on the site. That's gotten a lot of attention in these hearings in Washington. That's exactly the kind of thing that our antitrust law is supposed to prevent. But then that's sort of predatory pricing. But then this other issue of them, yes, they are constantly identifying hot sellers, often very sort of obscure products that are suddenly selling very well, and then coming out with their own version of that product under one of their private labels, and putting that seller just essentially just quashing them. And they're able to do this, of course, because they have so much data on what's selling on the site. And that's the fundamental conflict that's come under scrutiny now from Lena Khan and others, that they have the platform where they are able to collect all the data. They know everything that's happening on the platform, but then they're also competing against sellers on the platform. And
that predatory pricing, David, that in effect forced this diaper company to sell out to Amazon, was not prosecuted by the Justice Department's Antitrust Division under Obama. So they got away with it, and they say, what's not to like? Let's do more of it. Well, let me suggest something, Alec. I've watched the antitrust issue over the decades, and there is Tim Wu now in the Economic Advisory Office to the President, and there's Lena Khan in the Federal Trade Commission office as a commissioner. None of this is going to have any effect. The Congress is moribund. You represent a rising generation of terrific, in-depth writers of the dark side of our country. And I hope that one or more of you will focus on the one institution that can turn all of this around. It's called the U.S. Congress, which is often dismissed as impossible, ossified, conflicted, corrupted. That's not where the action is, I was told by people committed to doing something about climate disruption. Really? That's not where the action is? That's where the constitutional power is. That's where all the lobbyists are. When I go up and down the corridors in Congress, I bump into coal, oil, gas lobbyists. They must think that Congress is where the action is, either in a active or deliberately inactive manner, in terms of 535 people representing our sovereign power that we've delegated it to. So I do hope that you or some of your colleagues in the up and coming generation of writers will focus a lot about Congress.
And now, Dr. Michael Crome tells us about another important issue going on between the FDA and Big Pharma over a new Alzheimer's drug.
Cuba is about to announce a massive export capability of several vaccines for which they have had double-blind scientific clinical studies, and they may well be way ahead of the U.S. on this very shortly. Just recently, Michael, Public Citizen put out a warning to the Food and Drug Administration that is considering approving a drug that allegedly treats Alzheimer's. Can you tell us about why you're opposed?
Sure. The drug you're referencing is called aducanumab, and it's been made by a company called Biogen. And we strongly oppose approval of this drug because the evidence from clinical trials testing the drug fail to show that the drug works. More troubling is the fact that the company Biogen closely collaborated with the FDA. So there was this inappropriate close collaboration between the agency that's going to make a decision about whether to approve the drug and the company that makes the drug. Back in 2019, the company actually terminated early the two major studies that were testing the drug, comparing the drug to a placebo in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And those two clinical trials were essentially identical. One showed the drug didn't work at either a low dose or high dose. The other showed that the drug didn't work at a low dose and maybe worked at a high dose. And because of that, after an analysis about halfway through the trials, the company said, we need to stop because it looks like the drug doesn't work. And that was the appropriate decision to make. Nevertheless, several months later, in collaboration with the FDA, they went back and looked at the data from those trials and said, oh, actually, we think the drug works. And they then worked closely with the FDA to reanalyze the data and basically came up with a very biased assessment that shows, oh, the drug works and it's very promising. And so they went ahead and sought FDA approval. And before they submitted their application and afterwards, there was this really extraordinary and unprecedented collaboration between the company and the agency that led to a very biased review by agency reviewers. And basically, they're cherry picking the data. They're saying this one partially positive study is good enough, and the negative study we're pretty much going to ignore. And that's just unacceptable way to approach science.
Michael, is this tied in any way to one of the two proposed nominees to head the FDA by President Joe Biden? Dr. Woodcock, who's been in the FDA for years, catering to the drug companies' demands?
So, unfortunately, this sort of is consistent with a pattern in which the agency has grown much too close to the companies that it regulates, to the point that it's resulted in what we call regulatory capture, where the agency, instead of acting in the best interest of public health, is acting in the best interest of the companies that it's supposed to regulate. And if the agency were to approve this drug based upon inadequate evidence, it would give false hope to millions of patients. And as we told the Secretary of the Health and Human Services, Secretary Becerra, we said, because of the number of patients who would be eligible for this drug and the exorbitant price it would cost, this could potentially bankrupt the Medicare program and families through the copays. And so we cannot allow a drug like this to come to market unless we have definitive evidence that it provides significant clinical benefit, and we certainly do not have that.
Well, right now, Dr. Woodcock is the acting director. She's in the running to become permanent, but Mr. Sharfstein is her competitor. Who's likely to get this critical job?
Well, certainly industry, the pharmaceutical industry and other industries are rooting strongly for Dr. Woodcock to be named the commissioner. We strongly oppose that. She has, over her 25 years at the agency, fostered a close relationship between the agency and the pharmaceutical industry that has undermined public health. So she would obviously be the wrong choice. Josh Sharfstein is someone who we think would be more attuned to protecting public health. He would be a better choice. At this point, it's unclear who's going to get the nomination.
Well, let's hope this imbroglio over this Alzheimer's supposed treatment puts more focus on Dr. Woodcock's long concessionary career with the drug companies. I need to add this point. A while back, we had a highly regarded health science reporter, Jean Carper, come on the program. And she had written a book and produced a documentary on what she calls the Alzheimer's industry. That is, the approach by a lot of profit-seeking organizations and their consultants to deal with the business of Alzheimer's and all the treatment and the lucrative profits, and how a lot of syndromes are not Alzheimer's, that they call Alzheimer's. And she produced this documentary called Monster in the Mind, where she interviewed a lot of leading experts on this malady who had a healthy dose of skepticism about the over-commercialization of the way Alzheimer's is reported on and discussed in both mass media and professional circles. She also put out a book called Preventing Alzheimer's and Dementia, 101 New Ways to Save Your Aging Brain. You know, some of the obvious things like keep yourself mentally exercised and alert, having a good diet, engaging in daily exercise. These have been proven to improve mental agility as the person ages. How do you view this so-called Alzheimer's industry, Michael Carome?
Well, clearly, Alzheimer's is a major health problem, but there are a tremendous amount of industries have sprung up trying to find or proposing cures, many of which are not helpful, but certainly exercise and diet and mental activities are important, just staying just generally healthy and improving mental health. One of the, certainly there's been for 20 years now a lot of attention on what's called the amyloid hypothesis, that this disease is caused by the buildup of material called amyloid in the brain, and that if we could just stop that or remove it, we can cure the disease. And over 20 years, there have probably been 20 drugs have been attempted to develop. The companies tried to develop 20 drugs for the disease targeting amyloid, and all of them have failed. None of them have worked. And this aducanumab is just one more in a series of these 20 drugs targeting the same thing. And we may have the hypothesis wrong. That's the problem. And given all the negative studies that have followed for aducanumab, there's a high probability that this one partially positive study out of 2 is what's called a false positive, that the drug really doesn't work, and it did not work in that study, but we got a false result.
Well, those of you who are worried about relatives of an advanced age, you might want to look at the documentary Monster in the Mind and pick up the book by Jean Carper on preventing Alzheimer's and dementia in 101 ways. And for a very modest price, you can get access 24/7 to the best, most active and accurate database over the decades about drugs that you may be prescribed for a certain ailment that give you a bad side effect, but there are other drugs that you weren't prescribed that would have less side effects. And how would they subscribe to that?
You can get information on how to describe that by going to worstpills.org. Worst pills, all one word.
I've called it one of the 2 best deals in consumer protection information.
Finally, Ralph responds to more of your listener questions.
So, Ralph, I wanted to let you know that we have a listener. His name is Martin Stevenson, and he sent a copy of a letter to us that he sent to his reps for Washington State, and he edited for each one, and he's going to work on the Bush war crimes next. So that's very encouraging.
Very much so. Martin Stevenson from the state of Washington. exactly what we'd like other listeners to do. So thank you very much for showing the way, Martin.
And we can actually put a copy of this letter so that if others want to take Martin's cue as far as verbiage goes, which is always helpful, it'll be there for you.
This next question comes to us from Ben Leet. The subject matter is Taft-Hartley. I read Ralph Nader's excellent letter about the Biden-Labor relationship. I disagree.
Well, he disagrees because he thinks the pending legislation by the Democrats called the PRO Act is going to solve a lot of the problems caused by Taft-Hartley. This is a very complicated piece of legislation. Taft-Hartley passed in 1947 and never repealed. And my reading of it is it still holds a lot of handcuffs against organizing and implementing labor unions. So while the PRO Act is better than nothing, while it does some good things, it still is going to be dominated by the overriding monster, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which was so extreme that its main sponsor, conservative Senator Robert Taft, offered to amend it and sandpaper some of its clause, and the labor unions turned it down because they were so outraged they wanted to repeal the whole thing. And it's still on the books, unfortunately. The letter that Ben is talking about is actually my recent column, and you can read the whole thing by going to nader.org. And while you're at it, get it free by signing up every week. You get it free by signing up once on nader.org.
All right, thank you for that. This next one comes from actually a reporter from KPFT, the Pacifica Houston affiliate, and his name is John Moeller. And he wants us to call attention to a hunger strike that's been going on, at least when he wrote this, it was day 17, by a woman named Diane Wilson against polluters in Texas. And he says every morning, Miss Wilson, a fourth-generation shrimper, parks her red pickup truck and unfurls her signs across the water from a shuttered Alcoa plant that once leaked tons of mercury that now rests under Matagorda Bay. The area is a Superfund site that also sustains a local economy of commercial fishermen. Now, she's gone on a hunger strike here, and John talked to Miss Wilson for a story, says she's a great interview. She's a happy warrior, but a warrior through and through. She reminds him of Lois Gibbs, who has appeared on our show and would probably make a very good guest, and he learned about her from Jim Hightower, our old friend. What about that, Ralph?
Well, she really looks like a determined advocate. It's a nightmare scenario, fishing area where there's a lot of mercury in the mud at the bottom due to the activity of a Alcoa plant, which is now closed. But she also, according to this reporter, Steve, in 2019, she successfully defended nearby La Cava Bay by winning a $50 million settlement from plastic manufacturing giant Formosa, the largest citizen suit versus an industrial polluter in history. So she's quite an advocate. We want to have her on the show. Thank you very much.
All right. This next question is actually not really a question. It's from a listener, and we wanted to share it with you. It comes from listener Don McAdam, and he's referencing our show about the case against George W. Bush. He says, "Dear Ralph, David, and Steve, I've been listening to your show for a while now, and I love it. Thank you for your work." Thank you, Don. He says, "I just now listened to your episode with Stephen Markoff. It was during David's expert reading of Thomas Young's letter that I had to pause the playback. I was seething with anger. That anger I woke up with every day during the Iraq War. Studying the war became my second job. Third, actually. I was a father and a husband. I probably had more than 30 letters and a couple of op-eds regarding the Iraq debacle published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I agree with you and Mr. Markoff about how essential it is to hold George W. Bush accountable for the needless deaths of American service personnel, and goddamn Nancy Pelosi for abrogating her obligation as the leader of a co-equal branch of government tasked with oversight to ignore these most serious crimes. Thank you for reading Mr. Young's letter. It reminded me of my obligation and privilege, because unlike Thomas Young, I am still breathing, to continue to fight for justice and for all of those like Thomas Young died for a lie. Sincerely, Don McAdam."
Thank you, Don. You give a fresh breath of righteous anger to the program. And I hope a lot of listeners shared your response to David reading Thomas Young's last letter before he died from wounds incurred in the criminal invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush and Dick Cheney.
All right, now I want to conclude this segment, Ralph, and read to you a review I just recently picked up. And we get those all the time, and I don't send them all to you because I know you have a lot to read. But I just wanted to read this to you, and it's a review on the show. And it says, Ralph still has a brilliant and discerning mind. He says, I continue to be impressed by Ralph and his ability to be incisive about issues and know the details and have a long history of knowledge with them, sometimes way more than the knowledge his guest has. He is and continues to be humble and modest when guests who couldn't remember the name of his book, just the content. Ralph did not have to interrupt to repeat the name of the book, as if I've heard other podcast hosts do. Also, Steve and David contribute with their also insightful questions based on the podcast we've just heard with some different perspectives that are interesting. Thank you for that. He says, I also appreciate that after segment for podcast listeners where Ralph will take specific questions and always answers them with knowledgeable answers. He's an inspiration to seniors remaining cognitively balanced and clear at an older age. Must be his diet or the fact that he thinks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. And Steve and David deserve these encomiums, of course, and all the other volunteers who makes this show possible. We get our share of brickbats, so it's nice to get an encomium once in a while. And about the diet is in the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, if you'll permit a plug. It's the delicious and nutritious recipes that my mother developed and raised her 4 children on, and it's all available. Good gift for Mother's and Father's Day. Just go to the bookstore or the online vendor, and if you want an autographed copy, you can go to Akashic Books in New York City. That's AKASCHIC Books in New York City. Thank you very much.
Do you play chess, Ralph? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I did.
Were you good at it?
Well, as a high school kid, I thought it was too slow.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome author Pete Davis, whose book, Dedicated, explores how our restless modern society can get us stuck in quote-unquote infinite browsing mode. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way